Dr. Julia Long, who's going to be telling us about focusing mostly on one of the essays by Marilyn Frye, but we will hear a little bit about the rest of the work of Marilyn Frye. Thank you so much for coming. This is part of a series where we are looking at radical feminist ideas and works, and we'll do this every week and upload to YouTube. So without further ado, welcome, Julia, and thank you so much for talking to us about Marilyn Frye.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Thanks very much. Yes, so good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning here, and I think it's morning probably across most of Europe. So good morning, everybody, and good afternoon, good evening, and good middle of the night, depending on where you are. So I've decided this morning, actually, I'm just going to change my view settings because it's a bit distracting that I can see myself in the full screen. I'll just change my screen settings. I've decided to talk about this particular collection today. Now, I don't know if that's the right or the wrong way around. It's probably in the reverse. The Politics of Reality by the academic philosopher, radical feminist academic philosopher Marilyn Frye. And I wanted to talk about this particular collection because I've found it so helpful to me over the years to really help clarify my thinking about exactly what this series is about, radical feminist perspectives. What I love about Marilyn Frye's work is that working in, I guess, I'm not too sure because I'm not a philosopher, but I guess what is some kind of like analytic philosophy tradition. She takes a certain idea, a certain concept, or in the case of the particular essay that I want to talk about today, a certain emotion, which is anger, a certain response, emotional response, and then explores that in terms of what is that particular thing, what are the parameters of that thing, what can it tell us about women's experience, and she explores it with such clarity in a way I find absolutely beautiful and just really deeply satisfying to read. So that's what I want to share with everyone today. But just as, so I'm going to focus on the essay that's called A Note on Anger. But just to say a little bit about this collection, which actually also another reason I wanted to share it was that when I was teaching, I would often introduce a particular, although I was teaching in the discipline of sociology, I would often use an essay by Marilyn Frye as a kind of introductory piece, whether it was about, you know, whatever we were talking about, structural oppression or objectification, because I just found that the students really loved it and really responded to it. And it helped to kind of clarify exactly the nature of the thing that we were talking about. So anyway, just to say a little bit about this collection, it was written very much in the kind of, I guess, heyday of the women's liberation movement, because she says in the preface that she began making notes on some of the essays as early as 1970. Some of them had really taken shape by 1974. I'm not sure exactly when she wrote the piece that I'm going to be talking about. But so although this was published in 1983, it's very much, to me, it's very much the product of a lot of the thinking, the analysis, and the scholarship and the activism that was taking place throughout the 1970s. So I think it really shows the kind of work that became possible in the 1980s within academia. She was working as an academic philosopher and earning a living in that capacity, which I find pretty remarkable these days, in the to be writing the kind of thing that she was writing, the fact that that was even possible then, and that it was so much, she was writing so much as someone who was very actively engaged in the women's liberation movement. And the nature and quality of this scholarship, I think, is so much reflective of what was going on with the women's movement politically then, as well as what the kind of academic analysis that Frye herself applies to it. So something else that she says right at the beginning, where is it now? In the introduction is, where is it? She says, these essays are written at least as much for the ear as for the eye, perhaps more so. I hope they will be read aloud, both in and out of academic settings. So I thought this is absolutely perfect for us. Maybe at the time that she was writing, she maybe couldn't have quite envisaged the kind of setting that Jo and others have created now in terms of the reading of her work. You know, it tended to be much more in that women were meeting directly in small groups. But I think this is a really fitting setting to read aloud this particular essay. So what I'd like to do is read it and share it with everybody, and discuss it a little bit as I go along, some of the thoughts that I've had about it. And then hopefully there'll be enough time in the chat for us to talk about it. And maybe I know that Jo will be keeping an eye on the chat, so maybe we can have more of, even though it's not exactly an interactive conversation, we can have something more of an interactive conversation. And I would like to say that who knows if Marilyn Frye ever happens upon this video, or maybe if she's even watching herself. I know it's probably not the right time zone for her. But there's absolutely an open invitation if she would like to participate in the series and come and discuss her work herself or in conversation with any of us. Obviously that would be absolutely wonderful, but I hope that she approves of our dissemination and sharing of her work now. So I think that's enough of a preamble about the whole thing. I'm going to say just very briefly why I've chosen this note on anger to read out. And for me, it's because there seems to be, if we're talking in terms of this, the kind of feminist climate, whatever we want to call it, in the UK, the country that that I live in at the time, at the moment, there's obviously been this big mobilization around what I would say is transgenderism, the ideology of transgenderism, what is increasingly called gender identity ideology. There's been a big mobilization around that. But what I have certainly experienced within that milieu, where radical feminist voices and maybe certain other voices I've seen have been quite marginalized in many ways from some of the activism and some of the anyway, whatever. I think it's been quite marginalized. What I see is a taboo around women's anger, a taboo around women being angry and women getting angry, or certainly a kind of the attempt to impose limits on our anger and an attempt to suggest very much as the dominant culture is suggesting that we should play nice and be kind, and all the rest of it. There's a lot of that going on, and obviously I think that is very much part of the much wider cultural and political taboo around women's anger. Given that we live in a context of male domination, we can see historically the way that women's anger has been received and has been treated and has been suppressed. And I think what I see going on within this so-called gender critical movement at the moment is kind of a rather unreflected upon perpetuation of that cultural taboo around women's anger. And I think that's something that needs to be challenged, and that we would all benefit from reflecting upon. So that's why this particular essay has really spoken to me. So it's only about half a dozen pages, or maybe a little bit more. So I'm going to read it out and then speak about it as we go along, and hopefully it's going to chime with women's experience, not just here, but also with our experience, in whichever context that we're working in. And just as a kind of guide, maybe to help us, those of us who haven't read the essay yet, to think a little bit about, or to kind of be steered through the essay. What she talks about is anger, the nature of anger when we feel angry, and then she introduces the concepts of domain, the domains which we assert for ourselves, which then, if they get violated or disrespected, that we might feel anger. The relationship between anger, domain, respect, and uptake. These are I think the key concepts that she uses. So I'll read it out, and here we go. Joe, if anything is not working at any particular time, or if you think I need to maybe cut a little bit or speed up, please let me know. You know, depending on, because I know it's quite a thing to listen to something for this amount of time. But I think the essay is more than worth it. So, it is a tiresome truth of women's experience that our anger is generally not well received. Men, and sometimes women, ignore it, see it as our being upset or hysterical, or see it as craziness. Attention is turned to not to what we are angry about, but to the project of calming us down and to the topic of our mental stability. It is as common as dirty socks. Every woman knows it, has lived it. Men receive women's anger as incongruous and irrational, and in many cases, they are simply unable to improvise any way to cope with it. They strike out physically, slapping or beating the angry woman, or they retreat, covering their incompetence with something like, "I can't deal with you when you're like this." At this point, just earlier, Frye credits somebody called CS for their criticism of earlier drafts of this essay, so I wanted to reflect that as well. So, I don't read men's misreading of women's anger and their inability to respond appropriately to it as wholly or always willful and malicious, as always simply a pretense put up just to frustrate the anger and avoid acting on the matter the anger is about. It has often not felt to me like simple perversity in the situations I have experienced, and this judgment is supported also by my experience on the other side of oppression's barriers, as a white woman encountering the anger of women of colour. The anger is in fact sane and sound, but its seeming crazy and bizarre to the receiver is also real. In many situations, men really do experience women's anger as some sort of unnatural and baffling event that has no intelligible place in the causal order unless the man can see the woman as out of order. Though it is correct to deplore and denounce this odd combination of ignorance and incompetence as sexist or racist, that is neither intellectually nor politically sufficient. We can, if we will, learn something from this phenomenon. So at this point, Frye then goes on to think about what anger is. Anger seems to be a reaction to being thwarted, frustrated, or harmed. It comes when your momentum is dispersed or deflected. You are going along, living your life, tending your business, pursuing your project, and then you are stopped. A bureaucratic tangle, someone's unwillingness to lend reasonable assistance, the breakdown of a car. The energy that was moving you along your course cannot flow. It's blocked, it becomes turbulent. In some cases, you feel frustrated, irritated, disoriented, or depressed. In some cases, you become angry. The frustrating situations which generate anger, as opposed to those which merely make you feel displeased or depressed are those in which you see yourself not simply as obstructed or hindered, but as wronged. You become angry when you see the obstruction or hindrance as unjust or unfair, or when you see it as due to someone's malice or inexcusable incompetence. Most of us, if we are kept from going to the concert or the ball game by the weather, are disappointed, maybe grouchy, perhaps depressed. But if we're kept from going because our partner lost the tickets, we are more likely to be angry. If a person does shake a fist at the sky in anger about the weather, she is either ridiculous or she is pretending or even believing that there is some sort of agent up there whose responsibility in this matter makes the snowstorm a wrong rather than a misfortune. Anger implies not only that the inhibition or obstruction was distressing, but that it was an effect. In the British context, I'm reminded at this point, of how irrational it is to get angry with a phenomenon that is kind of beyond human control. Is those of us who are my age remember in the episode of Fawlty Towers where Basil Fawlty grabs a tree branch and starts hitting the car and cursing the car and saying, "Thank you so much, so bloody much for going wrong." That obviously the humor and comedy of that is because it's an irrational anger to take that anger on an inanimate object like that. Okay, so anyway, so she goes on to think about the nature of anger, developing this idea. To be or be perceived as wronged, you have to be or be perceived as right. Anger is always righteous. To be angry, you have to have some sense of the rightness or propriety of your position and your interest in whatever has been hindered, interfered with, or harmed. And anger implies a claim to such rightness or propriety. When you're not right or in the right, anger is inappropriate or impossible. Suppose that in the midst of cooking something, you realize that you need mushrooms. You've seen an ad in the paper that says a particular store has a special on mushrooms. You dash off to that store, but find that they don't have any mushrooms at any price. You may be angry. But if it turns out that you misremembered the ad and it was actually another store's ad, that will take the wind out of your sails. If you're not right in your expectation, you are not wronged in its disappointment. There are many kinds and senses of presence, propriety, position, and place, many kinds of being in the right. I don't mean to speak just of right in some strict political or legal sense. I mean to speak of something which is the logical mate of respect. When a person is harmlessly about her business, pursuing her interests as she sees fit, employing means and using resources which are properly hers to employ, respect dictates that you permit her actions and the objects and conditions these require to be under her control or to happen as felicitously as the fates will allow. If she's engaged in building bookshelves, respect dictates that you not saunter up and take the hammer without bothering to ask her if she's finished with it, unless, of course, you need it to defend both your lives by braining a dangerous intruder. Whether or not the hammer is, in a legal sense, her property, it is in her domain and associated with her by the web of connections her purposive behavior weaves. If you walk off with it in the absence of some overriding factor like the intruder, your act implies that you don't acknowledge that you do not acknowledge that it is rightful that the hammer be in her domain. For instance, that you think she does not have the right to use it because she stole it, or she ought not to be making bookshelves on company time, or she's botched it up so badly she shouldn't bother continuing anyway, or you simply don't think she or her project is worth minimal recognition and consideration. If you think any of these things, then there is something about her and or her project which you're not respecting. The domain one acknowledges in respecting a person, a project, or act is not simply physical, encompassing physical objects. Acknowledgement of right may dictate refraining from making conversation which would distract a person, or it might dictate encouraging her or not discouraging her. Her attention, her confidence, her sense of well-being, her freedom to speak her mind, her access to knowledge and skills are all matters within her domain. And maybe I'll just break here and say a little bit about it, because I don't know how difficult it is to be. Is it okay, Joe? Is it okay to follow? Yeah, okay. So I think what she's saying here is really important, where she's saying anger implies a claim to domain. And if we put it into the political sphere at the moment, in terms of the encroachment, or well, not just encroachment, but the violation of women's domain, that is transgenderism. I think we can see here, we can understand that, you know, this notion of women as a sex class, it implies not just women's sex-based political rights, which I often think, I often feel a bit frustrated with that term, because I'd like to, I wonder, what are our sex-based rights? Do we even have these things? At the moment in the United Kingdom, men can rape women and girls with almost with impunity. The rape conviction rate is unbelievably and catastrophically low. I think it's something like around 1%, which means that 99, at least 99 out of 100 rapists will have no consequence for raping women. So given that context, what are these sex-based rights which we are endlessly talking about? Like, what are they? In what context, in what way do they actually exist and manifest? I think it's, I feel quite frustrated that we're endlessly rehearsing this term women's sex-based rights, when we barely even have any. But I find this notion of domain here really, really, to me, really invaluable in thinking about the nature of that encroachment on our domain that transgenderism is, or that will to violate our domain. So where Frye talks about somebody going about her business, pursuing her project, pursuing her interest, her right to do that in an uninterrupted way, in a way that allows her the resources and time and you know, whatever that she needs to do that. Which again, we can, when we start to think about this, it really highlights for me how little we have of that. But I think this idea of domain, it to me is a more accurate way of talking about what transgenderists are wishing or determined to deny us. So I think this is really important, this idea of domain and our claim to domain, and maybe that's something we can think about a bit more. So so she says, if someone walks off with the hammer and then she angrily demands that you bring it back. Implicitly, I claim that my project is worthy, that I am within my rights to be doing it, that the web of connections it weaves rightly encompasses that hammer. I'm just skipping a little bit. Implicitly, I claim the right to do this work, the propriety of relying only on my own judgment if I wish, and the sanctity of whatever confidence I have in my abilities and the success of the project. And then she builds on this idea of domain. She says, there is something I demand that you respect. So this notion of domain, our domain that we determine for ourselves, is also something that that then we demand as being worthy of respect, which again I think is a brilliant insight. And she looks at this relationship between anger as being a violation of our domain and the disrespect of us and that domain. But also this the way in which our anger then is received when we express it. She brings in this, I think, very useful idea of uptake. In what context is our anger actually received and acknowledged and respected? Where does it get uptake, and where is it dismissed or repressed or suppressed or not recognized as being valid? So this is what she comes on to in this next section. And what I think is beautiful about this essay is that it's applicable to something that we feel on so many levels. It can be, you know, in the most intimate and personal of levels, in terms of personal relationships, family relationships, friendships, work-based relationships, but also I think very much on the political level, very much so, in terms of what's happening and what I see happening in terms of the violation of our domain and this sort of supposed unintelligibility of our anger when we express that anger, and some of that unwillingness to recognize our anger is very much coming from gender critical feminists who basically don't want us to be angry, and who I think maybe have some difficulties in recognizing their own anger and understanding their own anger, or certainly expressing it. So this next section then about uptake. Being angry is usefully understood on analogy with acts the philosopher J.L. Austin called speech acts. Now, it was probably, I think, apart from this essay, that I became familiar with this idea of speech acts from the work of Judith Butler, because she talks about these speech acts quite a bit and develops them into her notion of performativity, and also the philosopher Ray Langton also uses this idea of speech acts. So probably some of us anyway with the academic background might be familiar with this idea. So anyway, this idea of speech acts, when you say something like I promise or I apologize, you don't just assert or report something about yourself, you also reorient yourself and another person to each other. You become committed if you promise something, another comes to count on you. You undo a debt, an imbalance, or when you apologize, you undo a debt, an imbalance of good and ill will is repaired. This alteration of relations requires and involves a certain cooperation from the second party. You can say, I promise I'll write you, but also the other must take herself to be someone to whom you are obligated and must count on your doing what you said you'd do. If the second party's uptake is not forthcoming, the relationship between the two does not take the intended shape and the promise collapses. Your speech just hangs there, embarrassed, unconsummated. Now, this I think is quite brilliant. Being angry at someone is somewhat like a speech act in that it has a certain conventional force whereby it sets people up in a certain sort of orientation to each other. And like a speech act, it cannot come off if it doesn't get uptake. And she gives this example again, which I think is a really quite perfect example. One woman told of this experience. She had gone to some trouble to adjust the carburetor on her car, and shortly thereafter, an attendant at a gas station started monkeying with it. She was dismayed and sharply told him to stop. He became very agitated and yelled at her, calling her a crazy bitch. Now, Frye says, other responses might have been forthcoming from the attendant. He might have demanded to know why he shouldn't touch it. He might have defensively claimed he was only looking at it and wasn't going to touch it. He might have tried to persuade her that it was indeed the right thing to do to try changing its adjustment. All of these responses take the anger on by directly responding to the claims implicit in it, accepting them or challenging them, accepting or defending himself against the implicit charge or accusation. He did not meet the anger and its claims. He moved to a different level. What he did was irrelevant. He changed the subject from the matter of his actions and the carburetor to the matter of her character and sanity. He did not give her anger uptake. And I think, isn't this something that we see a lot? Certainly this is something I've seen a lot. And I think we can all probably come up with these kinds of scenarios where men do not recognize women's anger as valid. So they don't give it uptake, and they then totally shift in actually a very irrational way themselves. They shift to something that is completely irrelevant. which is the character insanity of the women involved, of the woman involved. But also, this is something that probably we've seen on social media, where a woman makes a very valid criticism of something that is going on politically, and the thread is very quickly then changed to commentary on that woman's character. This is something I've seen time and time again. So that if someone criticizes a particular stance or a particular, I don't know, article, that the woman who wrote that article or took a stance, it very quickly becomes a question of her character, and either, but look at all the work she's done, she's amazing, she's wonderful, which actually is not relevant to that particular issue, or she's terrible, she's racist, she's bigoted, she's this, that, or the other, and trying to discredit her character, again, without reference to, without uptake of the particular issue that someone is angry about, the stance that someone is angry about. So I think this is something that's worth all of us bearing in mind. I really see this shifting of domain from anger about a particular approach or a particular stance that has consequences for all of us, to a shift then to either a kind of elevation or assassination of someone's character. And I doubt that I'm the only one who's noticed this. So anyway, back to the carburetor situation. Deprived of uptake, the woman's anger is left as just a burst of expression of individual feeling. As a social act, an act of communication, it just doesn't happen. It is, as Austin would have said, non-played. Now, I'm going to skip a little bit because I really want to make sure I've finished the thing and have a bit of a chance for some at least a little bit of interaction at the end. So she says that where there is no uptake and the anger isn't is unrecognized, the claimant then can be dismissed as in this case a so-called crazy bitch. So one's anger presupposes certain things about what sort of being one is and what sorts of relations are possible between oneself and another. The patterns of claims someone can and cannot countenance, of the acts one can and cannot give uptake to, is a partial map of one's worldview. It reveals something of one's understanding of the essential natures and relations of things. So this man in the garage has a certain worldview that does not allow for him to recognize that woman's anger as valid and legitimate. He can't even recognize that it even exists. He has to dismiss her as a crazy bitch. So I like this next bit. You say the movie is at 7:30, and I disagree, saying it's at 7 o'clock. I am puzzled by your getting it wrong, since I think you must have phoned the theatre just as I did. But we are still in the same world of belief and discourse. Another day, you say you are the Messiah and I should worship you. This situation is rather different. I don't know how to argue with you about that, assuming I am satisfied that we mean the same things by these words. I have certain understandings of what a Messiah would be if there were one, of what worship is, and of the circumstances under which worship might be appropriate. These are enmeshed far more deeply in my basic understanding of the world than is my confidence in the health of any one particular human being I may encounter. As I understand this world, human individuals run amok far more often than messiahs appear, if they ever do. If I am convinced that you are serious, I can only suppose there is, in some sense, something wrong with you. To get angry is to claim implicitly that one is a certain sort of being, a being which can, and in this case does, stand in a certain relation and position apropos the other one, the being one is angry at. One claims that one is in certain ways and dimensions respectable. One makes claims upon respect. Now, I think this is a really brilliant sentence, a very insightful sentence. For any woman to presuppose any such thing of herself is at best potentially problematic and at worst incomprehensible in the world of male supremacy, where women are women with a capital W and men are men with a capital M. A man's concept of woman and of man and his understanding of what sorts of relations and connections are possible between beings of these sorts, to a great extent determine the range of his capacity to comprehend these claims, and hence of his capacity to give uptake to women's anger. In some cases, women can get angry without much risk of being thought crazy, hushed up, or beaten up. Usually, women can get angry at children or on behalf of children. And again, isn't this interesting in terms of the whole debates or movement around transgenderism? I think it's far more acceptable for women to get angry about what is being done to children than what is being done to us and our own domain and our ability to move freely in the world. It strikes me that the concerns around children and any anger around what is being done to children is more acceptable when women articulate that than when we assert our own rights. She also goes on to say, aside from being angry on behalf of children, she says a woman may get angry. May get away with being angry at some oaf who slammed a door and thus ruined her souffle, or at another who disarranged the pages of a report she has typed and is collating. On the other hand, she's not likely to get away with being angry at the oaf who maladjusts her carburetor. The pattern is obvious. Kids' homemaking and secretarial service belong to women. Cars belong to men. So what Frye goes on to talk about is that we can use anger, and whether it gets uptake or not, as an instrument of cartography. We can use it to see where women are allowed a certain realm where we can get angry, and where we are absolutely not allowed that realm where our anger is seen as illegitimate. And also something that struck me when I was reading this about the way that it shows this pattern is the amount of abuse that I don't remember her name, but there's, I think, a woman commentator in men's sports, I think particularly men's football, a woman commentator who has received huge amounts of abuse recently. I'm talking again in the British context, but others may have seen this. It definitely featured on the news. It was really grotesque and horrendous abuse. And again, if that woman had remained in the domain of talking about I don't know, childcare or cookery, I don't think she would have received that the nature of that abuse. It's clearly that men perceive her as encroaching on a domain that is not legitimately hers. That's what generates, or that's what then results in their unrighteous anger and their abuse of her. So she talks about that as long as women remain in the realm of mother, caretaker, conserver, and helpmate, her claim to authority, interest, presence, and place will make sense to relevant others, because it's likely to accord well enough with their concept of woman. So then in the next section, Frye then goes on to talk about how through the women's movement she talks about women in the 19th century who extended the range in which women's anger might be tolerated. We're indebted to women of the 19th century for extending the range of tolerance of women's anger. The struggles and victories of abolitionists, suffragists, prohibitionists, and other reformers make it relatively safe for women to get angry publicly on behalf, she says, in behalf, this is American English, I would say on behalf of great moral causes. Generally speaking, women can now get angry about such things as nuclear energy and arms, pollution, war, starving children, or drunken driving. And maybe we can think about this in some of the current movements like environmentalism, Black Lives Matter, some of these kind of movements. Certainly what we have now is a bit of a travesty of the movement of lesbian rights or lesbian and gay rights, this kind of LGBT movement. Women can get angry as long as they stay within the male-dominated domain of these movements. I'm going to, again, I think just skip this little bit to make sure that I finish in time. But I think what she says here is really important, because we don't see that women's anger is consistently treated as a taboo or not valid or as hysterical. You know, in some contexts we do see women getting angry, but what she said is where women are get angry on in these other political projects, she sees that it could be seen as an extension of mothering into matters of public welfare. It still permits women's anger only on behalf or in behalf of others, not on our own behalves, which I think again is such an important insight. A woman's anger on another's behalf is far more likely to get uptake and even acceptance than her anger on her own behalf. I'm gonna skip this bit, but it's worth obviously reading the whole thing. Hence, it is safer to get angry about nuclear power than about one's own rape. The former is more likely to be intelligible to get uptake. To expand the scope of one's intelligible anger is to change one's place in the universe, to change another's concept of what one is, to become something different in that social and collective scheme which determines the limits of the intelligible. 19th century women succeeded in expanding the concept of woman, that is really the concept of mother, to the point where a woman could express anger in a public, on a public matter and be found intelligible. Contemporary feminists, and remember she was talking in the 1970s and 80s, contemporary feminists have taken on the more radical project of expanding the concept of woman to the point where a woman can assert herself and make demands upon respect in public or private, simply on or in her own behalf. Not that is as any degree of as any kind of degree of mother, but simply as a being herself worthy of respect. So okay, I think I'm going to just say a little bit now about something that hopefully that I can apply that idea to. That was my own experience of earlier this week. So I went up to Glasgow, and I would like to thank Kelly J. Keane Mitchell, who absolutely facilitated my participation in that event as part of her commitment to women and girls. I went up to Glasgow to support a rally which was organised in support of Marion Miller, who is a Scottish woman who has been charged with, I believe it's malicious communications, for a number of tweets that basically asserted quite obvious material reality, and one in particular, which was a photograph of a suffragette ribbon that was tied around a fence. So a group called For Women Scotland, and also Standing for Women, co-organised this event in Glasgow to support her. And it was an absolutely brilliant event held on Glasgow Green with, I don't know, I reckon around 300 women and some men there. who were all who were there in support of Marion Miller and in support of Women of Scotland in defending what we're calling our sex-based rights, but I think in terms of defending our domain, our, broadly speaking, our domain, women's domain. So it was an absolutely brilliant event. There were some fantastic speeches. There was some really wonderful speeches. I learned a huge amount from being there. But also on this at this event, I suddenly saw appearing a man who is a known autogynephile in this country, wearing a dress. He calls himself Debbie, wearing a dress and kind of appearing amidst all of this event and the banners and the placards and the speeches, and the what I really want to highlight as a kind of in a way a baffling phenomenon is how that can even be possible at a women's an event for women asserting women's rights, how that can even be possible that someone who is the absolute embodiment of what we are resisting, what we are absolutely resisting and mobilizing against, how someone who is the embodiment of that can turn up in that context and not just be tolerated, but also can be, really fawned over and welcomed. And not only that, but is paid by a magazine, The Spectator, to go up and attend that and then write about it, write about that event, about women's rights and women's domain, as the very embodiment of the problem, of the nature, the very particular nature of the violation that we are challenging. And I'm really, the only thing really that heartens me about that situation is the fact that he was directly challenged by Kelly J. Keane, who's known as Posy Parker, who I understand directly challenged him and told him that he absolutely had no place to be there. And what I'm wondering is, why did we not all collectively do that? Why did we not? I didn't do that. I as soon as I saw him, I didn't want to have anything to do with him. I removed myself from being anywhere near him, and I didn't want to interact with him in any way. But I did go and sing one of my songs that I think made my position absolutely clear. But since that encounter, I've witnessed, because I live quite close to the sea, I've witnessed the phenomenon of a buzzard flying overhead, flying kind of over the gardens of the road where I live, who's obviously intending on trying to prey on young on baby seagulls. I've witnessed that the seagulls seeing off that buzzard in such a refreshing, direct and uncompromising way. It's really something to witness when you see those seagulls determined to protect their young, and they gather in numbers and make a lot of noise and see off that buzzard. And that buzzard was, really very much, the buzzard was persistent and kept coming back and was seen off by those seagulls. And that I take as an absolutely brilliant example of those seagulls asserting their domain, actually, interestingly, asserting themselves as mothers, or I don't know, maybe parents as well. I don't know if there were male seagulls doing that too, but doing that on behalf of their young. But it immediately raises the question for me: why are we not doing that? Or why are we doing that in such an undeveloped way? And where we are doing it, it often is denounced by other women, and certainly by mainstream gender critical feminists. So what Frye says, and I will just now read the final section, is that okay, yeah, I'll read the final section. She says, for better or for worse, in each of our lives, others' concepts of us are revealed by the limits of the intelligibility of our anger. And I think that also includes our own intelligibility of our own anger. And if we don't understand our anger, what is it about our own lives and our right to our own lives that we are failing to fully bring to consciousness? This, I think, is my favorite line of the whole essay. Anger can be an instrument of cartography. By determining where, with whom, about what, and in what circumstances one can get angry and can get uptake, one can map others' concepts of who and what one is. One woman took this thought home with her and tried it out. She walked about the apartment she shared, not unhappily, with her young husband, testing in imagination for the viability of her anger. In what situations her anger would work, would get uptake. She discovered the pattern was very simple and clear. It went with the floor plan. She could get angry quite freely in the kitchen and somewhat less freely and about a more limited range of things in the living room. She could not get angry in the bedroom. Anger, domain, respect. So that's how Frye ends that essay. But I also think there's a real richness there to think about the taboos of our anger here, where it does and doesn't get uptake, and what that tells us about our concepts of ourselves and others' concepts of ourselves. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Julia, I'm going to try to put gallery view on and get everybody following host view. So it should be that you can see both of us, hopefully. Gallery view. Right, sorry, I'm going to try and get it so that everybody can see both of us. And that's somehow, unfortunately, not worked yet.
Oh, they can see us. They're saying they can see us.
Can they see both of us?
Yeah. Everyone's saying they can see us. Yeah.
Both of us. That's brilliant. Well, my iPad can't. I've got this control mechanism, which is my iPad is meant to be what you lot can see, what everyone can see. But anyway, never mind. So that's perfect if everyone can see us. Good. So Julia, thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting. And what's great is it's really fertile. It really made me think. And from the chat, it looks as if everybody's thinking slightly differently and being able to see things in slightly different ways. And then it's also, explaining to or bringing to everybody's attention the brilliant work of Marilyn Frye. There are a couple of points in the chat that I picked up that I wanted to mention. One was that Peggy Lures mentioned that there's some very good writing by Virginia Woolf and a couple of others on anger. So that sort of links up to what you were talking about. So it's she's saying Art and Anger by Jane Marcus is a marvelous book on the subject of anger. And there's the works of Virginia Woolf and Sylvia Plath and others. And then another comment that was interesting to me was Sheila Jeffries said she was said to be very, very angry when she was reasonably young, and it was suggested that she go to see a therapist to calm her down, which of course, luckily for us, she didn't do. Then there was a sort of discussion about a little bit later on about women being able to be angry on behalf of animals or others, and that's very often a thing that women have done, is being angry on someone else's behalf, following what you were saying, also following. Yeah, and then there was a question that came up, which I thought would be interesting to see what you said, is what danger did the man who was dressed as a woman at the Glasgow demonstration, what danger did he pose? And I think it says to the women at the demo, but it might be generally. What danger did he pose? Can you articulate that for us?
Well, I wonder what the woman means when she says what danger. Like, did she mean physical danger? He didn't pose a physical danger. But in terms of danger to our mental health, well-being, he absolutely he posed a really huge kind of ruinous danger to that. But I suppose I don't really see it so much in terms of that word danger, because I think that is used to limit what is a legitimate anger. Like, so men are only a problem in women's spaces if they pose a physical danger that they're going to rape or kill us. That's kind of given, so that can minimize our anger. But he posed a complete and entire danger to our domain, to our right to a domain, to us to pursue our project freely within the integrity of that own project. He posed an absolute danger to that, because actually his presence thoroughly violated it, and yeah, a ruinous danger, I would say. I think we can think it might be a useful thing to think about in terms of our response. I didn't challenge him directly. I really questioned myself as to why I didn't. And I think it's probably a few different things. One of which I tend not to engage with men about any of this at all. I engage with men really very little on the whole. Anyway, and I didn't want him to be there. I didn't want to have any interaction with him. I think sometimes when we become so angry, we become very inarticulate. I don't trust myself to be in any way articulate if I did actually try to speak to him, whereas I think Kelly J was very articulate. Sometimes probably a lot of us have this feeling. I don't trust myself to restrain myself physically. I definitely have that feeling where I don't necessarily know quite how I would respond, because of the anger that we all feel that's, you know, accumulated over many years, and particularly intensified recently. But also, if I'm honest, probably I was subject to, at least in some ways, to the kind of English taboo of sort of social norms, and not upsetting the apple cart in terms of the women who'd organised that event. I mean, obviously we weren't in England, and maybe it's less of a taboo in Scotland. You know, maybe women have less of an issue articulating their anger there. But certainly that was not in evidence in terms of the response to Hayton. But I also think there is a power in completely ignoring these intruders, completely ignoring them. So don't give them uptake. Don't give them uptake with their presence. And then if everyone did that consistently, they wouldn't keep turning up. And I think my kind of lack of direct response, but although I did sing a song about autogynephiles, like very much to release my anger there and to make it very clear that it was absolutely not welcome. So that's how I did it. But I also think by giving that attention, because what we know about men and autogynephilia, by giving them any attention, it's also fuel, isn't it? It's also fuel to the narcissist. You know, I really wonder if some horrible part of his paraphilia is that he actually, in a way, quite enjoyed being directly told what's what by Kelly J. I wouldn't be surprised. So I do think that anger can take many different forms, and if we're conscious about it, we can kind of choose how we use it. But it's the lack of consciousness or the fear of it, I think, is a huge problem. And certainly that's helped to create this situation now where that man thinks that he's going to be welcome at that sort of event.
Well, thank you so much, Julia. We've come to the end of our time, and so we've done 1 hour. We're going to upload this as a YouTube premiere in about 6 hours. So it will be then available for women, particularly in the United States and the Americas, South America, to watch it, and then they'll be able to be in the chat. And I'll let you know, Julia, and anybody else who subscribes to the YouTube channel, you should get a notification for that when it's happening, but you probably don't want to watch it again anyway. It was really, really interesting. There is so much more to talk about. And so we're going to do this every week. If you have ideas for it, send them in, sort of topics or books or speakers, info@womensdeclaration.com. Same time next week, we'll be doing this. And the final thing I want to say is that when I was researching this topic yesterday, in case I had to say something, which luckily I didn't, I found there's a really good series of webinars called by Feminist Heretics. And they've done a lot of similar sort of stuff at Radical Feminist Perspectives. And I put one of them in the chat. So that might be something if anybody wants to follow this up right now. There's some really good videos in Feminist Heretics. Yeah, so thank you very much. And Julia, thank you so much. And have you got a final thing you'd like to say to women?
Yeah, I'm sorry that it probably took longer reading it than I thought. So we haven't had that much chance to engage with the chat, which is really interesting. So I will have a read of the chat afterwards, and I hope that maybe just the introduction of that topic and that particular essay could be used for further discussions and thinking about our current situation, because I do think it's an absolutely brilliant essay by Marilyn Frye. So thanks everybody.
Yeah, brilliant. And we'll come back to her in the future. And we'll also, one thing that somebody suggested last week is that we publish a program of what we're likely to be doing, which we are starting to try to get together. There's a link on the Women's Declaration website called Radical Feminist Perspectives. We'll put something up there when we know it, and we'll also publicize it here. So thanks so much for everybody for coming, because it's just brilliant that we can sort of start to think together about all of this stuff. And thank you, of course, to Dr. Julia Long for this brilliant discussion. Okay, bye everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.